Tonight on Nation to Nation, Idle No More is 5 years old, and one of its founders says the movement is just as influential as ever.
Idle No More is just as busy now as it's ever been because people are realizing that this government makes promises that they're not keeping.
An Ottawa think tank has named Jody Wilson-Raybould its Policymaker of the Year.
Done a remarkable job of taking the whole field of Indigenous affairs from the margins of Canadian politics and moving it to the centre of Canadian politics.
And NDP MP Charlie Angus says the Trudeau government's commitments to Indigenous people are only a start.
But that system that was built by Duncan Campbell Scott, it was built to last, and we have to take that system down.
Welcome to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lamar. Tonight is our last episode of 2017, and it's been nearly a year since I relocated to Ottawa to host this show and report on the goings-on up on Parliament Hill. So in 3 minutes or less, here's my impressions. Too many press conferences to count. Some were triumphant.
This is a victory for democracy.
Some, not so much.
Don't speak to us that way.
Stop right now. You do not speak to us that way. We are human beings, and the way that you're speaking to us
is not acceptable.
No,
stop it.
Almost as many committee meetings where witnesses told MPs some hard truths.
That the incarceration rate for Indigenous people keeps climbing year after year after year, unrelentlessly.
Bills were passed, including S3. It's supposed to end sexual discrimination in the Indian Act.
May it please Your Excellency, the Senate and the House
And
of
yes,
Commons.
that's all royal assent is. Governor General Juliette Payette nodding her head. I thought she'd have to sign a piece of paper or something.
Show respect for this institution, the Honourable Minister.
And then there's question period. I watched a lot of that.
Why is there such a significant staff turnover, and what is she going to do to reassure families that she will personally make sure that this inquiry gets back on track?
Well, the Honourable Minister of Indigenous Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we're committed to ending this ongoing national tragedy.
Oh boy, the inquiry, and you know which one I'm talking about, had a rough 12 months. It ended the year with the Assembly of First Nations calling for Chief Commissioner Marion Buller's resignation.
I think you have to go. You need to step down to salvage this inquiry. They fought too hard.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau continued to tout there is no relationship more important to him than with Indigenous people.
Building a true nation-to-nation relationship.
Yes, I heard that phrase from government many times. Maybe it's why he gave us the old U.S. Embassy to use on Aboriginal Day and split Indigenous Affairs into 2 departments. We now have 2 ministers for the price of almost 1. No one knows yet the final cost. On Canada's 150th birthday, Parliament Hill got a teepee, but it wasn't there to remind Aboriginal people to blow out any candles.
The bricks that were used to build this were built in a sand pit where they found bones of Algonquin people.
It's since been replaced by a $5.6 million skating rink. And there are some nice teepees across the river in Gatineau, Quebec now. What a view. But let's not forget the Senate. A Cree woman from Manitoba, Mary Jane McCallum, was appointed to it. And living legend Buffy St. Marie was honored in the Red Chamber. She had some advice.
Idle no more. Go to the website. I'm not going to list the things that they're doing, but please go to their website and look for Idle no more calls for change.
Thank you, Buffy St. Marie, for that nice segue. It has been almost exactly 5 years since Idle no more began in Saskatoon at a teach-in protesting a piece of Harper government legislation and the abuses of treaty rights. The movement may not be as public as it once was, but it certainly hasn't gone away. This weekend, rallies are planned in downtown Winnipeg and elsewhere. 4 women are credited as the founders. One of them is Sheila McLean. Joins me now from Saskatoon. Welcome to the show, Ms. McLean.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for inviting me.
After 5 years, how relevant do you think Idle No More still is?
Well, Idle No More is just as relevant today as it was 5 years ago, that it's been described as a wave, another wave of resistance by Indigenous people of 500 years of colonization. So today, people are still addressing the issues that Idle No More brought to the forefront of protecting Indigenous rights and protecting the environment.
Now, there aren't many flash mobs anymore. I suppose, how has it changed over the past 5 years?
Well, there actually is one happening today in Toronto, and actually Winnipeg is doing a flash mob round dance as well before Christmas time. So they are still happening, but you're right that it's not as prevalent across the country, and that's because there's also other kinds of work to do. So people are going back into their communities, working in their institutions to really bring to the forefront the rights of Indigenous people and trying to build consciousness in Canadians like myself about what we can do to work in solidarity with Indigenous people on these issues.
You talk about building consciousness. I suppose what has been the biggest influence, I suppose, whether it's on the local or federal front?
The biggest influence, I think, in really educating the public has been using social media and, of course, mainstream media to bring these issues to the forefront, that we know that our educational institutions really have not done the work that needs to be done in helping Canadians to understand how important these issues are, how to be good guests on Indigenous territories, and how to understand how we're positioned as, in particular, white settler Canadians in a context of colonialism here in Canada.
Is the movement still the same as you and the 3 other founding women envisioned it those 5 years ago?
I think that the movement has always been exactly what it's supposed to be, which is each community decides how they want to manifest the issues and what issues are important to them. So it looks different across the country. There's, you know, some major themes that people focus on, which is Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty, and protecting the land and water, but how that plays out in each community is determined by the Indigenous community in those territories. So I think it has looked the same over the last 5 years.
Do you think you had any influence, say, on current federal policy? Of course, the Prime Minister always talks about no relationship is more important to him than Indigenous people. Do you think you've influenced him and his government?
Absolutely. Idle No More has influenced this government. I think they got into power promising to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, promising to protect Indigenous rights, and promising environmental protections. They haven't implemented any policies that are any different than Harper's government. They actually are exactly like Harper's government. So even though they got in on the promises to Idle No More that things would be different, the policies that they're instituting today are exactly the same. So this is why Idle No More is just as busy now as it's ever been, because people are realizing that this government makes promises that they're not keeping.
Having said that, how do you envision Idle No More changing over the next 5 years and even further into the future?
Well, I think that Idle No More will probably look very much like it does now. People have always been doing this work, the work of protecting Indigenous sovereignty. So I think that what you see, though, is that mainstream Canadians, white settlers, non-Indigenous people, are really building consciousness and trying to figure out what their role is in this process, because, of course, we're the biggest barriers to Indigenous sovereignty. So I see that our institutions will be held accountable, that our government will be held accountable for the continued, colonial policies and the continued violence towards Indigenous people. In particular with the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and other campaigns that are happening right now. I think what we'll see is that these issues will be dealt with continually in a very different way in the next 5 years.
Ms. McLean, I want to thank you again for talking to me this afternoon.
Thank you.
After the break, we speak to somebody from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about their Policymaker of the Year. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute is an Ottawa-based think tank. Earlier this week, it named its Policymaker of the Year, Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. To find out why, we spoke to Ken Coates, who is a historian currently at the University of Saskatchewan and a senior fellow of the Institute. He wrote the article giving Wilson-Raybould the title. Joining me now is Ken Coates, and thank you, Dr. Coates, for doing this. I know you're on vacation, and once again, thank you for doing this.
I'm absolutely delighted. It's a great story.
Why did you make Jody Wilson-Raybould your Policymaker of the Year?
Well, you know, two reasons. One has to do with the quality of the person, and the second one has to do with the urgency of the issues that sort of embodied in her political activity. So deal with the second one first. The current Liberal government has made Aboriginal affairs and nation-to-nation relationships the absolute centerpiece of its mandate, and has given a profile to Indigenous policies and Indigenous issues that this country has actually never seen before. The Prime Minister's commitment is very clear. The Liberal Cabinet's commitment is very clear, and they're trying to move on multiple fronts to get sort of something going and something moving. So in terms of the issue, this has been a year of high-profile attention to Indigenous rights, to Indigenous livelihoods and economic and social developments and what have you. And the second thing is, of course, the Minister Wilson-Raybould herself. A truly impressive individual, sort of new to federal politics, not new to politics. She's been involved with Assembly of First Nation politics for a long time. It does an amazing job as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, given one of the most challenging portfolios in the government. Not directly responsible for Indigenous affairs. There are now two ministers in that area. But she has really clearly been a lead spokesperson for the government on this file. Has done a remarkable job of ensuring that these issues of Indigenous peoples the issues do not fall off the table. Has been an eloquent spokesperson on a national scale. Has spoken directly to Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities about the issues and sort of explain why the government is moving when it is and how it is moving. And has really done a remarkable job of taking the whole field of Indigenous affairs from the margins of Canadian politics and moving it to the center of Canadian politics. Right now, Indigenous affairs are perhaps the single most important issue in Canada, getting an enormous amount of attention. It's long overdue, and Jody Wilson-Raybould plays a major role in that happening.
Of course, critics do say that you can't have a true nation-to-nation relationship if you join the other nation's government. Why do you think that that's not true in Jody Wilson-Raybould's case?
Well, she certainly demonstrates, in fact, that in order to make effective change, you have to have Indigenous representations in all levels of government. We've seen this happening increasingly at the provincial level. It certainly happens at the territorial level in the far north. But it's actually been very limited at the federal level. We've had occasional times when we've had Indigenous members of cabinet and Indigenous politicians, but they've had relatively little impact. Wilson-Raybould came into this position, I think, with the expectation that, and I have no knowledge of what the Prime Minister said to her and vice versa, but my guess is that the two of them sort of agreed that if she came on, she would have a free hand to really sort of lead the government in taking on this really important sort of topic. I think you also need somebody who sort of sits at the middle of these two processes. She's deep history, family history, personal history in Indigenous politics across the country. She knows all the Indigenous leaders very, very well. Now she's got a national profile and access to the Prime Minister and access to the cabinet table. She is demonstrating, in fact, that you can effect substantial systematic change in Indigenous relationships by participating with the Government of Canada.
Of course, she has received flack for her slow adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the speed the new cannabis laws being rolled out. Some First Nations say that's too quick. Shouldn't that be taken into account when naming her Policymaker of the Year?
Well, in fact, sometimes we've seen Policymakers of the Year from people who were just very controversial. And I think the interesting thing about Chief Wilson-Raybould is that her government's issues have tackled very controversial issues. There has been criticism. There hasn't been as much criticism as I would have expected, quite frankly, given the sensitivity of the topics. There's huge divisions of opinion and differences of opinion on these issues. Not everybody agrees that things should go in one direction or the other. And so, in fact, it's kind of intriguing to see how the Indigenous political community has been responding to her. Just to use the UNDRIP example as a for instance, I have been a lifelong supporter of Indigenous rights. I'm very anxious and eager to see Indigenous people secure their appropriate place within Canadian society and to be re-empowered and given their opportunity to share in national prosperity. I was one of those who was concerned that the government had acted too quickly in sort of indicating during the election campaign and afterwards that they were going to adopt UNDRIP. UNDRIP is a very complicated document, and the Canadian legal system is very complicated with regards to Indigenous rights. And it doesn't take very much to sort of mess things up, to sort of bring incompatible pieces of legislation or ideas together. So when the government first announced this, I actually wrote publicly and sort of said, I wish we hadn't done this yet. You can overpromise at times. And my own view was that the Prime Minister had done exactly that. So I was delighted when, in fact, about 6 months ago, the government said, we're going to go slow on this and we're going to look at it more carefully. They've now come back to the table, having looked at the issues and made sure that they can figure out a way to make UNDRIP compatible with Canadian law. So these are big issues. I'm not a huge fan of great symbolic measures that sort of just say we're going to do wonderful things or we're going to make these great promises. I think Indigenous people deserve action and meaningful action, things that really have an effect and change the way Indigenous people experience their lives and their political sort of opportunities within Canada. So the presence of controversy by itself is not something that would take one off the list. A couple of years ago, Donald Trump was named Person of the Year in the United States, and it wasn't because he was widely acclaimed by everybody in the country.
Okay, once again, I know you're on vacation. I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you for doing this.
This has been a highlight of the day. Thank you very much.
After the break, I speak to NDP MP Charlie Angus on why he felt he already had to update his 2-year-old book, Children of the Broken Treaty. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Charlie Angus was first elected as a member of Parliament in 2004, and since that time, he's been a staunch defender of Aboriginal rights. He's brought issues like the water crisis in Saskatchewan, or the need for a new school in Attawapiskat to the national forefront. Lately, it's been supporting St. Anne's residential school survivor Angela Shishish. In 2015, he wrote a book, Children of the Broken Treaty. It recently came out as a new edition with updated material. Charlie Angus joins me now. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So it's only been 2 years since you first published the book. Why does it need an update already?
Well, Children of the Broken Treaty is a story, I think, for Canadians to understand how we got here with the crisis, the suicide crisis, the youth, the battle for youth justice, Indigenous youth justice in Canada. And it tells the story of Shannon Kustashian, the incredible young Cree civil rights leader that we lost much too young. And that moment on Parliament Hill when she confronted the Indian Affairs Minister, and that's the first time in our long history that an Indigenous youth stood up and called out the power. So how did we get there? You know, the issues of the signing of the treaty, St. Anne's residential school, the story of what happened in Attawapiskat, to where we're going with the issues of the battle for Jordan's Principle, the ongoing suicide crisis in the northern communities. And the book did really well, but with the election of the Trudeau government, and there's so much focus on this new nation-to-nation relationship, University Regina Press said, we think we need to do an update to bring people further along the road. And so this
so it wasn't you, it was your publisher who asked for this.
The publisher came to me and said, we really think it's time, given that so much of the book captures up through the years of the Harper government, but where does the road go next? And so there's a lot of, the book doesn't have all the answers because we don't know where we're going, but we know that the road is moving, we know that change is happening, and we know that governments are going to be forced more and more to respond to the grassroots appeal across Canada for justice for children.
So I guess what can we expect in the new edition? What specifically have you updated?
Well, in the first edition we had talked about what happened in Thunder Bay with the youth and how that's tied to the larger issue of lack of schools in that. Certainly a lot's happened since then, the tragedy of Thunder Bay and the deaths of youth. Shine a light on what's happening with youth across the country, the issues of the suicide crisis, and how government is still not responding the way they should be. But a lot of it is about the battle over Jordan's Principle, the battle over education dollars, the battle over the child welfare funding, the battle against Cindy Blackstock. And we need to sort of separate the positive rhetoric of government with the fact that the big Indian affairs machine is still defiant, still fighting, and, you know, change is happening, but it's not happening fast enough.
So I guess from your perspective then, you haven't seen much of a change from the Trudeau government, elected just 2 years ago, from the Harper government. So you haven't seen much of a change then?
Well, I think I am pleased with the positive language from the Prime Minister. We're starting to see finally the Jordan Principle dollars starting to move. But I mean, it took 3 non-compliance orders. It took almost $1 million in court battles. It took the deaths of the children in Wapakika to force change. And what I'm trying to do with the book is to say we have to look deeper. There will be many education agreements signed in the future, and that will be important, the move of education dollars to the communities. But we still have a very broken system at Indian Affairs. We still have government officials who are refusing to even examine their responsibilities. And until we have a full picture on the underfunding of Indigenous children, these patterns, and their abusive patterns by government, will continue. So this is sort of laying out the pattern. The Trudeau government has made commitments, but that system that was built by Duncan Campbell Scott, it was built to last, and we have to take that system down.
Of course, it's easier on the opposition benches. It's easy to criticize the government. I suppose if you had to deal with budget dollars and whatnot, what could you do differently, I suppose, to smash the system? Does it take money, or is there a simpler way to do it?
Well, I think we have to do, and this is what I learned from you know, Shannon Coustache, you know, who's an incredible civil rights leader, but she taught me to see things through the eyes of the children. You know, I'd always looked at it as policy. I'd always looked at it as, you know, again, as an oppositional MP. But Shannon said, like, the children can't wait. And I think if there's one message of this book is, what kind of nation can squander the future of its children? And that is the #1 issue of our nation right now. So damn right, government's got to step up. You know, there's a million excuses not to make change, but there's always been a million excuses, and I think those excuses have run out. So this book is a call for change. It's a call about hope. It's a call about how change is happening with the young people, but we have to step up as adults. I remember Shannon said politicians are parents, and parents have a responsibility to their children, and I think that's a really profound thought.
Of course, Shannon died tragically in a car accident when she was 16. She'd be 23 now. Yeah. How much of her dream, Shannon's dream, has been fulfilled, do you think?
Well, I think Shannon would be really proud to see how the young people are moving. I think of Shannon every single day. I think she was an extraordinarily powerful young woman who came and I think changed our country for the better. She's been recognized as one of the most 150 famous women of Canadian history. You know, here's a girl who just wanted to go to school. We have the commitments on schools. We have language about child equity, but kids are still having to leave home in the reserve and live in boarding houses in Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout and Timmins and, you know, all across Canada. I think her vision has touched a generation, but government is still not living up to its promise.
Okay, well, again, thank you for doing this. I guess Christmas is coming up, so
make great Christmas gifts. Christmas gifts, everybody.
Hey, thank you, Charlie.
Children of the Broken Treaty, Charlie Angus.
We'll be away for 2 weeks, but back on January 11th. But if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca. I'm Todd Lamar, and from me and everyone here at Nation to Nation, have a great holiday season.